Hey everyone. So this is our 2+1 takeaway for this week. So this week, actually, we worked really well together as a team. I think because we had experience working together from the previous engagement, and we all discussed each of our takeaways and chose our final consensus takeaways in question, and then each of us broke out and focused on each one separately, and then we're also going to add on to it together as a team throughout our examples. So with that, and slightly going over our process, Josh will kick it off with our first takeaway.
Great. Thanks, Colleen. Yeah, so our first takeaway is that the actions of leaders significantly influence the ethical culture within an organization. Strong ethical leadership is not always easy, but Bill Daniels shows that you can be successful and keep your word and moral integrity. The counter to this is that unethical leadership will trickle down and reward unethical behavior throughout the organization, which can increase in severity over time and result in serious consequences, which is clear in the Enron reading and examples throughout the reading this week. And so I think as we were discussing this as a group, we all kind of thought it was refreshing to learn about Bill Daniels and his commitment to integrity and his follow through on his word throughout his career. One thing that I wish I encountered more in my career was a mentor like Bill. And I'm hoping that as I grow into more of a leadership role, I can provide that type of ethical and integrity mentoring to other people. It feels like, you can find examples of unethical behavior in the news on a daily basis, kind of an exercise that we do within our class. I think one that's kind of an interesting account is the Wells Fargo account fraud scandal. It really highlights how ill-conceived goals and those associative incentives can really create an environment that reward unethical behavior. And so as we were discussing this in a group, we kind of talked about the Wells Fargo thing, and Colleen and Adriana had some of their own examples. And so we're going to kind of send that over to Colleen.
Yeah, so for this one, this was really clear to me in the readings, especially with the Enron example, about how even though they had their own ethical, stance through I think it was their RICE program, that because the leaders kind of developed a culture that did not enforce any ethical practices, that definitely trickled down to the lower employees to act unethically as well. So because they did the whole rack and stack, or basically you cut people if they don't hit their numbers, that drove a practice that these employees were terrified to tell any higher up managers any bad things that were going on, any bad news, because if they shared this bad news, they were probably going to get fired. So because this was such an part of their culture, no one wanted to tell anyone what was happening in the company that was negative. So the decisions of these corporate leaders to put that practice into place trickled down throughout the entire organization and created a huge, culture of just an ethical behavior in general.
So our takeaway too was individual behavioral decisions are not made entirely rationally for several reasons. That includes human nature, heuristic, and biased thinking, which can drive people to make irrational decisions. It also is rare that people have full and complete information and facts pertinent to making informed decisions. Because of these combined factors, individuals might have to rely on a gut feeling to determine final ethical decisions. So, using the article Enron, a brief behavioral autopsy, Prentice discusses many examples of the auditors not acting rationally while auditing their clients, which was due to multiple biases, including hindsight, confirmation, and cognitive dissonance. And they also had acted heuristically or used mental shortcuts. And overall, these ways of thinking can drive people into making irrational and uninformed decisions, like the auditors for Enron. And this eventually caused the ethical collapse of the corporation due to the human nature of thinking, and which will most corporations will follow their leaders' thinkings and their precedents and how they act and react ethically and honestly. So they were also very over optimistic for what they were selling and what they were producing, even though they were actually putting all their debts into subsidiaries. And the auditors were okay with it. They signed it. The risk assessment group was also all right with it. And that's why they got away with what they got away with for so long. So with this being said, many companies will react to situations and make final decisions because of a gut feeling or a knee jerk. And for me, I've seen that in my current position, but my job also will use multiple departments to make a final decision. So there is that checks and balances, even if an executive goes, we need to do this right now because our customers are going to get upset. But then there are multiple other departments who are like, we can't do that because it makes us way too liable as a company. And that's just unethical and that's not okay to do, even if there's the high probability of there's nothing wrong with the product. So my company, there are individuals who do that, and I think that'll always happen, but we use the checks and balances system to ensure that these knee-jerk decisions don't just happen, and then we have to figure out how to alleviate all that situation afterwards. So Josh or Colleen, do you have any other examples for this?
Yeah, I think just real quickly, kind of as we were talking about this as a group, it really resonated with the in-class discussion last week and kind of talking about the gut decisions. And I think this has really personally opened my eyes to that there's other factors outside of the gut decision, and something that I use to make sure that, that I feel like I'm doing the ethical thing. But I think it really says, it's time to slow down and think about, you might have some bias that you're not aware of, or some environmental circumstances or incentives that you might not be thinking about within this decision. And so I think that's kind of one of the key parts of this takeaway. And now I think we're going to kind of hand it over to Colleen to discuss our outstanding question and close it out.
For our question is, will being aware of personal biases and behavioral decisions, such as hindsight bias and confirmation bias, truly help change ethical actions of corporate leaders? Or are these innate biases and the irrationality of human behavior so ingrained that no ethical training can alter patterns of corruption and cheating? So going through the readings, I found that there were tons of examples about the different types of biases that are natural to all people, including, as I listed before, confirmation bias, hindsight bias, overconfidence, self-serving bias, and numerous others. So reading through and looking at the videos, I found that there were a ton of examples of leaders who encountered these biases and used them to base decisions off of. But I struggled to find any really solid evidence that they can be avoided by simply being aware of your bias and knowing that it exists. So I would hope that executives can use the knowledge of their own biases to avoid making crucial ethical decisions or company decisions by basing it on their biases in the future. But it wasn't clear purely from the data we were given that it can really be achieved. So in my own work, I've been through a lot of diversity and inclusion training, and I'm not even a leader. So when you're a new LCode or leader, you have to go through a mandatory inclusion training. And the whole intention of the training is to make sure that each leader is aware of their personal biases so that they can avoid using those or basing decisions on those in the future. But it brings it back to the question, if you're aware of them, does that really change your behavior? So in order to answer this question, I thought it would be beneficial to do a formal psychological study on leaders who have been taught a curriculum like us that focuses heavily on ethics, and also look at leaders who have not had any ethics trainings at all, and look maybe 5 or so years down the road, what were the decisions of these leaders? Maybe speak to leaders directly and say, what was your thought process while making those decisions? And did you take ethics into consideration when you were making decisions or not? So real quick, in consideration of time, Adriana, do you want to expand on this?
Yeah, so I think that would be a really good experiment. I also, like I stated before, there really needs to be a good checks and balances that are actually utilized within the company to ensure that knee-jerk gut reactions, any of these biases, are not used for leadership making decisions that affect the whole company, its employees, its shareholders, and everything. There's this inherent human nature that we will always maybe have a bias and not really realize it. And as long as the company recognizes this, hopefully they follow their checks and balances like a risk assessment group or the auditing firm, and ensure that those biases and those heurisms and anything else that could potentially become unethical is caught beforehand instead of down the road.
Awesome. Thank you. In summary, those were our 2 takeaways and 1 question, and we hope you enjoyed it and maybe have some questions from that too.